All right, welcome back. So in the last video, we talked about how we can use consumer theory to talk about our decision to supply labor by thinking about the trade-off between leisure and consumption. So what we're going to do now is we're going to think about what our budget constraints are going to look like, right? What our feasible options are, and then we're going to think a little bit about what our preferences ought to look like. So let's start with the budget constraint. Let's imagine that you've got 24 hours a day. And you have a job that you can spend as much or as little time as you want working, where you earn $10 an hour for each hour that you spend working. And for now, let's imagine that you've got no other money, right? No one's giving you any income, you have nothing saved up, right? All you have is your earnings and your time. And we'll imagine for now, we're not going to worry about borrowing, we're not going to worry about saving. You're living for today, right? Whatever you earn today, you spend today. And we'll say that a unit of consumption, and we'll always make this assumption, a unit of consumption costs $1. Right? Because we're defining it that right. We're defining a unit of consumption as however much stuff you can buy for $1. Okay, so what we want to do, right, is we want to take this information and construct a graph that tells us how much leisure and how much consumption we can afford. So to start with, let's imagine that I didn't spend any time working at all, right? I spend 24 hours a day relaxing. In that case, how much consumption would I have? So I've got no money other than what I earn, right? If I spend 24 hours a day relaxing, I've got no money at all, right? So I would have 24 hours of leisure and 0 units of consumption. On the other hand, let's imagine that I spent all of my time working, right? What if I had, so if I had L equals 24, so rather than C would equal 0. On the other hand, let's say that if I decided to take 0 time in leisure, right? I spend 24 hours a day working. In that case, how much consumption could I afford? So I could afford my income, right? I could afford my wage times 24 hours, right? The amount of time that I spend working, which is going to be 240, right? So I spend all my time working, I take no leisure whatsoever, I could afford to have 240 units of consumption, but then I would have no time in leisure, right? Spend 100% of my time at work. And if I thought about the connection between all this, right? Each time that I spend 1 less hour in leisure, I add 10 units of consumption, right? So if I started with no leisure at all, right? And then I add 1 hour, I would, I take an hour break, then I would only have 230 units of consumption, right? So what this is going to look like, it's going to look like a straight line, and it's going to have a slope of -10, right? Okay. So what we've just drawn, right, is a budget constraint. That's all this is, right? It tells us that everything in here is feasible. Everything up here is not feasible. So if we're able to draw this budget constraint, let's think for a minute about what our budget equation has to be, right? How we're going to represent this constraint mathematically. And the way that I want to do that is I want to basically say, given that I spend L hours in leisure, how much consumption can I afford? So the general rule, right, is going to be my consumption is going to equal the amount of money that I make earning, right, which is going to be my wage rate times my total time minus my leisure hours, right? And then plus if I had some other money from something other than working. So in this case, right, I'll say my consumption is just 10 times 24 minus L, right, plus 0. Why does this make sense? Well, for every hour that I spend working, I get $10, right? How much time do I spend working? 24 minus the amount of time that I spend in leisure, right? So when I spend 24 hours in leisure, I spend no time working. When I spend 0 hours in leisure, I spend 24 hours working. Make sense so far? Cool. So this is a budget constraint, but I'm not happy with it yet because it doesn't look like what we've what we're used to, right? It doesn't look like the budget constraints that we've talked about before. So I'm going to make one little tweak. I'm going to add 10 times L to both sides. So I'll say C plus 10L has to be, this should be less than or equal to, right? Has to be less than or equal to 10 times 24, right? C plus 10L less than or equal to 240. And now this makes sense, right? Because if I think about my budget constraint, and I think about my, excuse me, and I think about my budget equation, right? My budget constraint has a slope of minus 10, vertical intercept of 240, horizontal intercept of 24. What I'm saying here is the price of consumption is 1, the price of leisure is 10, so my budget constraint is just the price of the horizontal good. The slope of my budget constraint is just the price of the horizontal good over the price of the vertical good, which is just going to be my wage rate divided by 1. So in general, again, right, we can do the same transformation to our general budget constraint here. I can say C plus WL less than or equal to W times total time plus my outside income. Cool. And so what this means, right, the intuition behind this slope is that each hour of leisure costs us our wage and consumption. So if you could make $10 an hour, you spend an hour on Facebook, that hour on Facebook cost you $10 because you gave up the opportunity to earn $10 that you could spend on $10 worth of stuff, right? 10 cans of beef roe. Cool. So next, let's talk about our preferences. So the first thing to say about preferences for leisure and consumption is that in many ways, they're going to operate much like the preferences we've been used to, right? We could write down all sorts of different utility functions that could represent different people's preferences over leisure and consumption, because people are different, right? People are allowed to have whatever preferences they want. But it can still be useful to think a little bit about what we might expect these preferences to look like and what determines what our preferences for leisure and consumption look like. So the first thing to remember in order to think about this is that leisure and consumption are both, in some sense, a collection of a bunch of different stuff, right? When we talk about your preferences for leisure, we're talking about your preferences for playing Frisbee in the park and washing the dishes and going to the movies and playing with your dog, right? When we talk about consumption, we're talking about your preferences for Honey Nut Cheerios and guitars and Frisbees and houses and college tuition, right? A whole bunch of different things. And we're always assuming that however much leisure and consumption you choose to get when you're making a labor market decision, you'll spend in the best way for you. So as a result, your preferences over leisure and consumption and how they're related to each other are going to depend on which of the many different things in the category leisure and which of the many different things in the category of consumption you value, and which things you value on the margin as you're making your decision. So, okay, so to be a little bit more specific about this, right, to be a little more concrete about this, let's imagine that for you personally, you only care about going to the movies, right? That's all you like in life. Sitting at home watching a pirated stream does nothing for you. You like sitting in the theater in the dark, watching on the big screen. So to go to the movies, you have to buy a ticket, which costs 15 bucks. And it takes 2 hours, right? So if we think about, does going to the movies constitute leisure or does it constitute consumption? The answer is that fundamentally it constitutes both, right? In order to go to the movies, you need $15 worth of consumption and you need 2 hours worth of leisure. So if this is all I care about, right? All I care about is the number of times I can go see a movie in the theater. What are my preferences going to be over leisure and consumption? I want you to think about that for a second. So I would argue that in this case, leisure and consumption are going to be perfect complements. Why are they perfect complements? Because they're only valuable to you when consumed in a fixed ratio, right? What you care about is the number of times you can see a movie. Seeing a movie takes $15 and 2 hours. So in this case, right, we would have a utility function over leisure and consumption that looks something like the minimum of movies worth of leisure, right, L over 2, and movies worth of consumption, C over 15. So if you had 4 hours of leisure and you had 30 bucks, right, your utility level would be 2, because you could see 2 movies. If I gave you an extra $1, it wouldn't do anything for you because you couldn't see any extra movies. Cool. So in this case, right, if you're the cinephile, then your preferences over leisure and consumption are going to be perfect complements because they're used together in a fixed ratio, right? They're only useful to you when you're using them together. So let's think about another extreme, right? Let's think about a different person with different preferences. Let's imagine that all you care about, you're a total germaphobe, right? All you care about is having a spotlessly clean apartment. There's two different ways that you can get a spotlessly clean apartment, right? The first one is you can spend an hour cleaning your apartment, right? That's enough time. You're good enough. In 1 hour, you can complete a cleaning. So you can clean an apartment. You can either spend 1 hour of leisure, or you can pay somebody to come in and clean your apartment for you, which let's say costs 20 bucks. Right? Heck, maybe I'll clean your apartment for 20 bucks. So in this case, right, what you care about is the number of times your apartment can get cleaned. Each cleaning either takes an hour of leisure or it takes $20 worth of consumption. So what are your preferences going to look like here? Again, I want you to think about it for a second. Pause the video if you want. So I'm going to argue, in this case, leisure and consumption are perfect substitutes. Right? They do the exact same job, cleaning your apartment. You only need one or the other. And so if we think about, right, what are your preferences going to look like, I would imagine something like your utility of leisure and consumption is going to equal 1 times L, right? 1 hour of leisure gets you a cleaning, plus 20 times C, right? The number of times my apartment can be cleaned is 1 times the number of hours I spend cleaning, and, oh, I'm sorry, what am I doing here? 1/20th times C, right? And 1/20th times the number of dollars that I spend, right? Why 1/20th? Because it takes $20 to get a cleaning. Cool, right? So in this case, I'm going to have preferences over leisure and consumption that are perfect substitutes. Now, of course, in the real world, right, we're not going to be people who only go to the movies or people who only clean our apartments. We're going to be people who do a variety of different things with money and with time. And the particular ways that we use our money and use our time are going to depend on how much money and time we actually have, right? Some things might be first priorities for us, some things might be last priorities for us. But in general, right, we'd expect, if we think about this problem, we expect that if we had lots and lots of time on our hands and not very much money, things where we could use time or money, we're generally going to accomplish with time, right? If you're poor but you've got lots of time on your hands, you clean your own apartment. On the other hand, right, if we've got lots and lots and lots of money and very little time, we're going to do all the things that could be accomplished with money or time with money. So if we wanted to graph a typical indifference curve for leisure and consumption, we might expect it to look something like this, right? The reason is, if we're up here, we've got lots and lots of consumption and very little leisure. We're going to spend our few hours of leisure doing things that there's no way that we can buy, right? Irreplaceable with money. In this case, it's probably getting a little bit of sleep, right? But it might also be spending time with our loved ones, right? Or, sailing on our yacht or whatever it is, right? Up here, everything that we can, we're having someone else clean our apartment, right? Everything that we can pay for, we've paid for. As we shift over towards low levels of consumption and large amounts of leisure, the opposite is the case, right? The little bit of consumption we have is being spent on things like buying the cheapest groceries available, and we're spending whatever time it takes to cook our meals, we're spending whatever time it takes to wash our own clothes, right? Walk instead of taking the bus, whatever we can do to save money. And as a result, right, our last hour of leisure isn't that valuable to us relative to consumption because we're doing a lot of things with time that we could spend just a little bit of money to accomplish, right? So the slope of our budget constraint, the slope of our indifference curve, right, which is our marginal rate of substitution, it's going to be du dl over du dc, as always, right? Marginal utility of leisure over the marginal utility of consumption. And what we expect is, much like other goods, right, this is going to be really, really high when we have very little leisure and lots of consumption, really low in the opposite. The one thing that's unique about this case is that as our MRS is changing, that's in part because we're shifting, I can be compensated for having less sleep by being able to, eat more caviar. So some of it is that we're changing the stuff we're consuming. The other thing that's happening is that we're changing the way that we're consuming things, right? We're accomplishing more tasks with money up here, more tasks with time down here. So some final takeaways, right, on our understanding of budget constraints and preferences for leisure and consumption. The first thing, right, is that our goods are leisure and consumption, right? We're going to say that the price of leisure is our effective wage rate W, right, is the amount of consumption we'd have to give up by taking an extra hour of leisure. And the price of consumption is just 1, right, because we're going to define consumption as $1 worth of stuff. And our budget constraint, as a result, is the amount of consumption we can afford when taking L units of leisure which we can either think of, right, as C less than or equal to our wage rate times the amount of time we spend working. Or we can rearrange this to look more like a typical budget constraint. C plus WL less than or equal to WT plus I. And these are saying exactly the same thing. Okay, awesome. So in the next video, I'm going to talk about income and substitution effects that come about as a result of a change in wage.